Hi, I'm Bhante Sujato, and I'm coming to you from the end of the world. And I'm here doing a bit of an experiment, doing a recording, and to talk about some things that maybe I don't have time for or don't get round to doing in my Dhamma talks. For today, I wanted to talk about the documentary the Planet of the Humans. So it's a documentary on climate change. It was produced by Michael Moore, and which wasn't actually made by him, but it was he was on the name as a producer, and it was produced quite a bit of controversy when it came out. I didn't watch it when it came out, but I just watched it now, and I've read some of the articles to and fro and discussion about it when it came out, and so I thought I would give a bit of a review and a bit of some reflections on it. I thought the film was poorly made and was almost kind of weirdly bad at making the argument that it wanted to make. But at the same time, it clearly had some things to say, and it clearly exposed some truths that we are often not willing to hear or not wanting to hear in the environmental movement. And, I can absolutely confirm from my own experience that a lot of the things that they were talking about, for example, the environmental cost of supposedly renewable energy sources, it's something that people in the environmental movement don't want to hear about, but it is manifestly and obviously real, even if not quite real in the way that the film imagined it to be. So what I'd like to do is maybe give a bit of an overview as to what some of the issues with the film as a whole were, and then look at some of the specifics that the film was raising up, and maybe try to reframe things in a way that's going to be more helpful or more useful. And one of the things that I have been going on about for a long time now is that the important number we need to look at is the global atmospheric CO2. And that's something that didn't come up at all in the film. And if you hear me typing in the background, then that is me looking up something on the internet as I'm talking, because I didn't do any research before this. Welcome to my life. But I'm just double checking what the global atmospheric CO2 is today on the Mauna Loa site. And so last time I checked, it was about 416 parts per million. Let's check what it is on the latest readings. So the film didn't actually talk about this, but it seems to me this is the main fact in this area, the reality, the simple, plain as day reality that we have been doing environmental work for decades, that we have been trying to reduce emissions, that we have been trying to switch to renewable forms of energy, and we have been trying to solve this problem of global atmospheric chaos, but we have rather persistently failed. And so the question then becomes why? Just checking the reading for December the 12th. It's actually December the 14th, so the Mauna Loa site is usually a couple of days that it'll take to post the figures. So December 12th reading is 416.14 parts per million. And probably worth noting that the average for this week is 415.86 parts per million, so the daily amount will fluctuate to some degree. And the weekly value from 1 year ago was 413.50 parts per million. So that means it's increased 2.3 parts per million in the past year, which is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. From 10 years ago, it was 391.72 parts per million. Now, a lot of the critics of the film, The Planet of the Humans, would criticize the data for being out of date, with the kind of implication that if they used modern up-to-date data, then things would be better. But, I mean, given that some of the footage was shot 10 years ago, I don't know if that's actually going to improve things. 10 years ago, 391.72 parts per million. and now it's 415.86 parts per million for this week. So, this is I think one of the responses that I had reading the critics of the Planet of the Humans was that the criticisms in many cases were factually well taken, but they kind of ignored a larger truth. And if you did use more up-to-date figures and examples, then I'm not sure that would actually help your case at all. Anyway, one of the if you have a look at the methods and the rhetorical methods of this, it's worth taking a few minutes to just consider this. I'm often asked by people, how do we navigate a world of fake news and information and all of these kinds of things, and how do we actually figure out what's true and what's not true? And let's do it. Let's look at some a media artifact and let's figure out how reliable it is. So the first thing that we can notice about this one is that they cited a bunch of particulars and then drew inferences from those particulars. That's the kind of the methodology. So by a particular, you look at a particular site, for example, a particular event. So you might look at, say, a concert. They looked at a couple of concerts which claimed to be using renewable energy. They looked at some examples of environmental organizations. They looked at a couple of interviews of environmentalists. They looked at certain forest clearing and environmental consequences of renewable energy, and then drew conclusions from those things. So the first thing to ask ourselves is, do the inferences are the inferences justified by the evidence that we've seen? Are the conclusions justified by the evidence that we've seen, or are they making a large leap of logic? And generally speaking, no, the conclusions are not justified by the evidence that's actually presented on the screen. So what they do is they present a bunch of sort of suggestive images and sound bites, and sort of follow this kind of conspiracy theory method of letting you make the conclusions for yourself. Right, so you give the evidence, but you don't state so clearly what the conclusion is. They hint at it, really, but they don't have a solid thesis, and they're not solidly saying, "Well, this is our evidence, this is our hypothesis, and this is why the evidence leads in this direction, and this is how we're reaching our conclusion from that evidence." So. In an important and large-scale event like this, we need to have more assessment of the details. And one of the things that was most obvious about this was the complete lack of expert advice and expert witnesses. I mean, let's be clear, the IPCC reports are extremely thorough and extremely careful, and they are based on the best available scientific evidence. There are many scientists, experts, professional environmentalists, engineers, people involved in the industry who could have been called upon and would have been delighted to talk about these things, and yet none of them appear in the film. And so that's, of course, a major red flag. The expert witnesses, such as they were the filmmakers themselves, which, again, kind of a red flag for a documentary. In the lack of expert witness and the lack of systematic evidence, what we're left with is really just a few fragments and a few bits and pieces which are drawn in often kind of bizarre ways to imply some kind of conclusion. I mean, just off the top of my head, one of the examples, there was a solar panel, and then they sort of rather ominously pointed out that the glass in the solar panel was produced by the Koch brothers industries. Now, the Koch brothers, of course, are the major funders of climate denialism, and anything to do with them is suspect, to say the least. At the same time, they are major industrialists, and the economy is incredibly interconnected. It's probably pretty much impossible to be producing things without having some involvement of Koch brothers in some way. And what does it mean? Like what kind of, it's like we're setting up this standard of purity, but we're not really saying why we're doing that. I mean, is it better to get old industries and actually involve them in a better industry? Or do we need to sort of set up some kind of purity standard that we have to have no involvement at all with anybody who has anything bad at all? I mean, that's just not how the world works. It's kind of sophomoric, to be honest, and it's kind of like, what's your solution to that? I mean, where are you going to get the glass for making your solar panels? You've got to get it from somewhere. So this kind of non sequitur is found constantly throughout the work, and it's not as if this kind of example I'm citing here is an exception. It's found all the way through. And I think it's really unfortunate because they are making some genuine and some important points, and there are very major problems that they're addressing. They just don't address them well. So the thesis of the documentary is that the environmental movement essentially has been co-opted by capitalism, and that rather than looking after the environment, its priority has shifted to promoting green energy, which essentially is owned and run for profit by the same people who were making profit from the old system. And this is why we are running out of time to do anything about climate change. And look, to a degree, I think that's true. I think that there is a lot to that, but I think that the case that they're making is made poorly, and I think the options that they were presenting were also presented poorly. I mean, you have to have some kind of thesis that can be assessed in some way, and this, apart from this kind of negative thesis, it didn't really have that much to say, and it didn't say it all that well. And for those of you who maybe have seen some of Michael Moore's documentaries like Bowling for Columbine and so on, then you will remember the wit and the charm that he brought to even a very devastating topic like school shootings. And you remember how funny it was. And there's none of that wit, there's none of that engaging quality in this documentary at all. Let's have a look at some of the specific examples. One of the early cases that it discusses in the film was some footage from the launch of the Chevy Volt. So this was about 2010, I think. The documentary is not very good at telling us the dates of things. It leaves us to work these things out. But the launch of the Chevy Volt was quite well known in the environmental movement. And more generally because, well, it was kind of a failure. And there is when we see that footage and you see the people who are supposed to be selling this thing are very clueless about what are the actual environmental consequences of the product that they're trying to sell as an environmental product. And even a simple question like, where does the electricity come from for these things, and what is the actual carbon output of that electricity? And then they just simply don't know these basic facts at all. And it should come as little surprise that the legacy automobile industry is hand in glove with the oil industry. Obviously, they've grown up together and lived together for their whole lives, and so their ability to shift to a renewable source of energy is problematic, to say the least. So at that time, it seems that the network that the Chevy Volt, when they were looking at that example, was running on was 93% coal, and so that was found to be a sufficient demonstration of how useless this technology was. Now, one of the problems with that whole presentation was that, I mean, who's heard of the Chevy Volt? I mean, I've heard of it because I've been following environmental news. But most people, they don't look to General Motors for their electric vehicles. They look to Tesla. And Tesla is the company that came along precisely because of the flaws that were so evident in that segment. And that's what people associate with electric vehicles, and they've changed the game, and pretty much everybody acknowledges now that we are in the last legs of petrol-powered vehicles, and that within the coming decade probably we'll see petrol-powered vehicles disappear completely as new vehicles to be replaced by electric vehicles. Now, those who have been critical of this segment have pointed out a number of perfectly true criticisms. One being that, generally speaking, the CO2 footprint of electric vehicles is in fact smaller than that of petrol vehicles, even if the network that powers them is powered largely from coal. And the reason for that is that when you produce energy at an industrial scale, you can do it more efficiently than you can if you make a small motor and put it inside a car. So even that example of the Chevy Volt with the 93% coal would have been somewhat more CO2 efficient than an equivalent petrol car of the same age. Probably. I mean, it's not always possible to examine these things precisely and in detail, and let us not forget that the car companies are lying to us. And just not long ago, Mercedes-Benz was uncovered lying yet again about their emissions from their vehicles. So let's not take any of the figures from any of these companies for granted. They are absolutely motivated to lie, and they absolutely will lie if they think they can get away with it. But still, the assessments by independent authorities conclude that electric vehicles do genuinely offer some environmental advantage. Nevertheless, it's only a percentage, right? It's, if you're operating mostly on a coal network, then you may be getting 10 or 20% less CO2 emissions than an equivalent petrol vehicle. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not orders of magnitude better. And to the extent that the network is powered by renewables, then of course the CO2 efficiency will improve. Again, but not kind of orders of magnitude better, but significantly better. So one of the problems, I think, with the presentation in the film was that not only did it focus on a failed product from a company that has failed to shift to electric vehicles, or failed to at least be driving that shift, it didn't look at the wider problems with electric vehicles and the more meaningful and frankly much more weird and cinematic problems with electric vehicles as they exist today. And it's a kind of a bizarre, if you like, failure to take advantage of a much more interesting story than the story of the failure of the Chevy Volt. Electric vehicles today are dominated by Tesla, which has come from nowhere and become one of the world's biggest companies. Along the way, it's fueled the creation of the world's richest man ever, Elon Musk, who's now, as I speak now, I think $270 billion, is more than a quarter trillionaire. I mean, if you think that you understand how much money that is, you really don't. The amount of wealth which is being generated is completely incomprehensible. So technically, there has been somewhat of a shift since the days of the Chevy Volt. The electricity networks that the Teslas are running on are often these days running on much more renewable energy, producing much less CO2. The engines and batteries and so on are obviously become more efficient. And so the benefits of using electric vehicles have definitely improved. And this has major benefits in certain respects, certainly in terms of the pollution and air quality in cities. This is absolutely a win for electric vehicles, and in itself is enough to justify the use of the electric vehicles. The air pollution is one of the underrated dangers of modern industrial society, And those of us who are lucky enough to live in a city like Sydney, which has reasonably clear air and we don't have to be afraid to walk outside, then don't forget what it's like to live in Delhi or in Shanghai and these places where it really is just poison to be walking around outside. And if we can introduce electric vehicles that's going to improve that situation, then that's great. In terms of their overall impact on climate change, then this is much more dubious. Remember, as I said before, that the global atmospheric CO2 is currently, on the day that I'm speaking, or a couple of days ago, is 416.14 parts per million. And it has been rising steadily since the records began in 1958. And in fact, it's not just rising steadily, it's accelerating. So right to the present day. And so when we read about all of the success stories of climate action, and we hear about reducing emissions, we hear about renewable energies, we hear about all of these things, reality check is that none of this has made any measurable impact at all on atmospheric CO2, which is the only thing that actually matters. Climate change is not being driven by the amount of petrol cars on the road. It's not being driven by emissions. It's not being driven by deforestation. It's being driven by atmospheric CO2. And the goal of stopping all of these things is to reduce the atmospheric CO2, or at least to slow the growth rate of it. But we're not slowing the growth rate of it. It's increasing at an accelerating rate. And so any assessment of the environmental movement and its effects has to begin there, and we have to begin by asking what's gone wrong. Why haven't we made any measurable difference at all to atmospheric CO2 and to how it's growing? And if we can't address that issue, then we're really not, frankly, we're not being honest. Of course, to add a caveat to that, CO2 is not the only thing driving climate change. There's also methane, N2O, and so on, but as well as other effects like atmospheric conditions, cloud cover, the reflectivity of ice, and so on, which also drive global warming, the moisture in the atmosphere, another one. But these things are all pretty much following similar kind of trends. We're not seeing improvements in any of these things. So global atmospheric CO2, as measured at the Mauna Loa station in Hawaii, acts as a precise and physically verifiable measure of the most important driver of global warming, and in addition acts as a proxy for other measures of global warming. So why is it that we see Teslas all through countries everywhere these days, and yet we don't see a corresponding drop in CO2? Why is it that people are telling us about how they've been reducing emissions, and yet we don't see a drop in corresponding CO2? I would argue that the reason for that is because we've been trained to look at the wrong things, and that our attention is being directed away from the things that matter to things that are easily manipulated and which are kind of beside the point at the end of the day. If we return to to electric vehicles, then that's a good example of this. We're told that so many electric vehicles are being sold. We're being told that there's a shift from petrol, and that this is great, and this is green, and this is good for the environment. We've been told that these things are environmentally friendly. We should retire all of these phrases. They're meaningless buzzwords that, in fact, are just not true. It's not true that electric vehicles are green. They're not good for the environment. They don't help anything in the environment. They're actually terrible for the environment. You have to mine all the materials to make the cars. You have to mine all the materials to make the batteries. You have to mine all the materials to make the solar energy that's going to fuel the thing. They have to process these things. It takes huge amounts of energy to produce the steel and to produce all of the other materials. When we're using new and exotic technologies, then we are, of course, using new and exotic materials in order to drive those things. And that is a cost of these things. They're not good for the environment at all. They are terrible for the environment. Once again, you may hear me tapping away as I'm just looking up a fact. And so it's true that the the power source of the electric vehicles is marginally an improvement over petrol vehicles, but that doesn't mean that it's good. The reality is that if we want to make improvements to the way that we produce carbon emissions from transport, from personal vehicles, then the solution is not fancy technology, I'm afraid. The solution is high-density housing, walkable cities, and public transport. And for almost everybody, if you want to really make a difference in your environmental impact, then move into a flat. If you want to get a new car, don't just use your old car. And if you must buy a car, then get a Corolla from the 90s. Those things will last forever. And use it as little as possible. Walk when you can, ride a bike when you can, catch a bus or a train, carpool, get lifts, whatever you can, and minimize the use of your cars. And that's going to have far more of an impact than shifting over to an electric vehicle. I mentioned before that one of the problems with the focus on the Chevy Volt was about how there's a much more interesting and dramatic story to be told, and from here on out the details of the story become almost cartoonishly evil, and it becomes almost impossible to actually comprehend that they're really true. But what can I say? Reality is fun that way. So in November the 10th, 2019, the country of Bolivia had a coup, and it was overturned essentially by the United States in order to gain access to their resources of lithium, which are needed for batteries, primarily the batteries being produced by Tesla. Now, you might think that this is part, obviously, of a long history of American imperialism and colonialism by the United States in South America. Nothing really new there. But what's interesting about what's the newness of it is to see how easily our new oligarchical overlords slot into the roles played historically. And if we think that the rise of Tesla is a rise of something good in the world, in response to accusations that this was a coup to provide lithium for his vehicles, Elon Musk's response on Twitter, July 25th, 2020, was, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." That's right. It's an actual quote from Elon Musk. It's not a just made up fact, and it's not a script from a movie of a cartoonishly evil version of Elon Musk. That is, in fact, what he said. "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." So this is the reality of electric vehicles, and they're not going to stand in the way of international law, human rights, national sovereignty, or anything else like that. They're going to use it to get what they want, because that is what lies behind the rise of the electric vehicle. It's not actually about looking after the environment. It's about getting whatever you want and not having to pay the cost of it. And this is the fundamental problem with the idea that technology is going to save us. Now, this is very far from being the most or the only sort of cartoonishly evil thing that Elon Musk has done or that is involved with the production of Tesla cars. Now, Tesla maintains a record of the environmental benefits that its vehicles have created according to its usage. Obviously, this is by comparing like buying a Tesla car to buying a petrol-driven car, not through buying a Tesla car compared to, say, catching a bus, in which case there would be nothing. But so they've got this kind of record going back years. Like they save a certain amount of CO2 for each car that's produced. And look, let's just take that on its face value. I don't really think we should be, but let's take it on its face value. A couple of years ago, Tesla then made a huge investment in Bitcoin. And by making that investment in Bitcoin, they completely wiped out all of the advantages that they'd made from their electric vehicles. That's right, yes. So when you're buying a Tesla, you're not actually making any advantage at all in terms of carbon emissions, because the people to whom your money is going is wasting that on complete rubbish like Bitcoin, and just like blithely and completely meaninglessly destructive to the environment, simply for the benefit of making money out of nothing. And so this is where your money is going. Now, if investing in Bitcoin was the worst thing that Tesla is doing, then that would be pretty bad. But really, we're only just getting started. One of the distinctive features of our modern generation of sort of capitalist leaders is that they're not just interested in making money, they're not just interested in establishing power and dominion, but what they really want to do is to colonize the galaxy. They want to become the imperial overlords of space. It's not an exaggeration. Elon Musk, on his Twitter account, actually called himself the Imperator of Mars. I mean, I'm guessing he was kind of joking, but this is who we are. These are little boys who watched Star Wars and who watched Blade Runner and who saw how the world was going to be colonized by these huge corporations and huge companies that would establish empires that would last for thousands of years. And they said, I want to be that guy. That's what they're doing. So everything that Tesla and Elon Musk is doing is about colonizing Mars to start with, and then later the galaxy. So do not think that his ambition is to protect the Earth. These people treat the Earth as a staging point for launching out what really matters, which is to colonize space. Needless to say, colonizing space is a dream and it won't happen. Certainly not in any foreseeable future. Space is like really big and it really wants to kill you. And so the ability of humans to shift beyond having a few satellites in space to colonizing the galaxy is not something that's going to be happening anytime soon, if at all. Anyway, look, I don't want to talk too much about the foolishness of this dream of colonizing space, but the important thing is, as far as we're concerned, is to do this. Elon Musk is developing his SpaceX program where they are launching rockets into space, which itself already has massive environmental consequences. The program at where they're launching it is destructive to the place, to the environment around there, to the homes, to the people in their lives. And this has been subject of a lot of complaints and a lot of problems because the project was misrepresented as being a small environmentally project from the beginning, and it really isn't. But bigger problems than that include the use of the fuel. Now, Elon Musk next year wants to start launching their Falcon Heavy launcher, which will be one of the biggest rockets ever. They want to start with launching every 2 weeks next year. That's 2022. Elon Musk does have a long history of over-promising and under-delivering, but it would be a mistake to underestimate his chances of succeeding. Each launch uses around 440 tons of kerosene and has a CO2 output of maybe 200 or 300 tons. That's each launch, and that's vast. Now, at the moment, of course, the amount of rockets being produced is relatively small, but they want to make thousands of these things. They want to establish satellites for the internet, which will obscure and change the night sky forever. And they want to be sending thousands of ships to Mars. And to do that, they will destroy the Earth. I mean, these things, it's almost impossible to overestimate the potential for damage that these things have. So this is what's happening when we give $250 billion into the hands of a man like Elon Musk. And so this, again, is one of the systematic problems with electric vehicles, is that they're solving quite the wrong problem in quite the wrong way. The real motivation behind electric vehicles is to say, how can we live like we do in California but not feel guilty about it? And so this is kind of assuaging the guilt of the rich at the cost of actually doing something meaningful about it. You know, if we look in LA, for example, the LA's had a strong environmental program for many years. They use a lot of renewable energies. The people of LA are, generally speaking, relatively environmentally conscious, certainly compared to Australia. And they've done a lot to help that. And yet, at the same time, the annual environmental output in LA is still 7.15 metric tons, compared to, say, New York, which is 5.38 metric tons. So why is New York so much less than LA? Well, because New York is a dense city. People walk, people catch the subway. And that's the difference. And if we want to really make a difference, we wouldn't be... Electric vehicles are a footnote, really. And if we really want to make a difference, we would be living in flats, catching the bus, walking. And this is one of the reasons why I'm here in Harris Park. It's one of the reasons why I got a dwelling here in a small old apartment, because this is the most environmentally friendly way to live. And I couldn't be telling everybody else how to do it if I wasn't going to be living it according to my own standards. So this is one of the problems with. So it's one of the problems with the film and the narrative which is developed in the film, but I think which has exposed, I think, a genuine problem with the environmental movement, but it didn't deal with it properly, and it didn't really look at the actual issues, but instead deflected us by looking at sort of something which was a bit meaningless, really. So that's electric vehicles. Let's look at a couple of the other issues which are raised in the film. One of the issues which is raised is the involvement of oil money with the environmentalists, and with the kind of, again, you have a couple of data points. A couple of organizations had donations from some mining companies and from fossil fuel companies, and this is sort of taken as sort of the implication is that this is sort of a condemnation of the environmental movement as a whole. But I mean, there was no attempt to really check this fact, no attempt to sort of look at the overall statistics, no attempt to talk to the people involved about this. And sure, you can look at public figures who have been, like Bill McKibben or Al Gore and so on, who've been doing this for years and have countless public interviews, and you can choose their worst moments and make them look bad if you want. But that's not a good way of doing journalism. It's not a good way of looking for the facts. And Bill McKibben's response was that not just it was that the account was misleading, but that it was dishonourable. And I think that that's actually a really good point. It's not the case that the environmental movement are just full of these sort of cartoonishly evil figures who are, colluding to make money out of fossil fuels and make money out of the capitalists, but rather that they are well-meaning individuals who do their best to try to make the change that they want. Along the way, you often find yourself making compromises, and sometimes you make the wrong compromise. And Bill McKibben admitted as much. One of the major focuses of the film was the foolishness of the so-called biomass electricity. And yeah, biomass is a terrible idea. We should never have done it. Bill McKibben made a mistake in endorsing it, as he has admitted, and no longer endorses it. Biomass essentially means chomping up nature and turning it into chips so he can burn it for electricity. It's horrible. Gas also is another one, and where environmentalists have been, I think, too ready to support the shift to gas as opposed to coal, and this is a mistake. We should never have done that. When I say we, I never did that, but it always seemed foolish to me. But you get used to. And this is, I think, the kind of larger scale issue, which I think the film is pointing to successfully but ungracefully. It's a larger scale issue that what tends to happen is that in progressive and environmental movements that we we want to see things from the other person's point of view. We want to be pragmatic. We want to appear as if we are operating in a common sense and rational world. And so often what we do is we pre-digest the answers and we pre-compromise them. And we come along to a meeting with our pre-compromised solutions, which then is kind of, when the other guys don't do that, of course, they come along and say what they want. And then out of the meeting then comes a double compromised solution, which then when is put into place is then triple compromised, because it never actually quite works out that way when you do it. And so because we have been not sticking up for what we really believe, then we have got used to living in a world where our beliefs and our values can't be taken seriously because we haven't taken them seriously. We haven't said to them, stuff the economics of it. We don't care how much it costs. What matters is not the price of the electricity. What matters is not ruining the world. And if renewables are more expensive, so what? If renewables are less reliable, so what? We have to do what is best for the world, and we have to pay the cost for that. And this is really, I think, a messaging which we have been just embarrassed to talk about. And I think this is why we're losing, because we don't seem to believe our own values, but we're compromising all along the way. Now, if we return to gas and to biomass, one of the questions which the film doesn't ask is why? Like, why did environmentalists go along with these kinds of things which seem to be so obviously destructive and foolish? And the kind of the implied answer is because they're in the pocket of big industry. But that's not actually true. That's not how environmentalists think, and it's not why they're making those decisions. The real reason is because, and this is something the film doesn't get into, is because coal is so much worse. And sure, biomass is terrible, gas is terrible, but coal is so much worse than any of these things on any metric. And it's almost impossible to overestimate how toxic and polluting and dangerous and deadly coal is. So once you see that, then you say, well, this is like not as bad as coal. Okay, better than nothing. And if you've got used to actually making little or no progress for many decades, finally someone's offering a solution that, okay, we know is not great, but it's not as bad as what we're doing already, then that can become attractive. So, again, I'm not saying that I don't agree at all with those choices, but I can understand why they would have made those choices. And I see people in the environmental movement doing that kind of thing all the time. And so, good-hearted people who are genuinely trying to make a difference are quite capable of making these kinds of compromises that at the end of the day turn out to not work. So I'm not going to go too much further into that question of the sort of the payments to the environmental industry from various industrialists and so on. I'll just say that, you know, you can't look at a couple of entries from a couple of organizations and say that that's representative of the entire movement. That's silly. Obviously, environmental movements should not be taking money from fossil fuel companies, from miners and from other people. But at the same time, we can't be imposing a unrealistic and sometimes absurd standard of purity on everybody, that they have to, if they're not absolutely pure all the time, then everything they say means nothing. Okay, so to the somewhat more substantial issue in the film was talking about the cost of renewables. And here, once more, I believe that they had genuine and important points to make, but they made them fairly poorly. And by making them poorly, they opened themselves up to genuine criticisms, failed to make the case that they wanted to make, but also they could have made a much stronger case. Now, obviously, producing any kind of energy is destructive to the environment. Producing solar panels is destructive to the environment. Producing wind energy is destructive. Producing wave energy, geothermal energy, hydro, anything is destructive to the environment. And the environmental movement has been guilty of colluding in creating the illusion that this is not the case. We call these energies green. They are not green. They do not help the planet. They're not good for the environment. They're not environmentally friendly. They're destructive technologies that destroy forests, that through mining destroy hills, destroy lands, they destroy communities and people, and they are terrible things that frankly shouldn't really exist. The reason why we propose them and to push for them is because they are not as bad as the alternative. Now, one of the kind of almost inexplicably odd kinds of argumentation that they use on that program is they move from saying, well, these things use carbon fuels, they use fossil fuels, therefore they're as bad as the thing that they're replacing. So they point to, for example, a thermal carbon plant in the desert, and they say, well, actually, you need gas to run the plant. Therefore, it's just as bad as running a gas plant. I mean, it's an absurd argument. I mean, they don't ask the question, how much gas do they use? And are they using more or less than you would if you were running a gas plant? And they don't even ask a lot of these basic physical questions about the realities of these things. So you can look up the facts easily enough on Wikipedia and many other sources, but as a rule of thumb, renewables produce on average something like 10% of the CO2 as compared to carbon. So biomass and gas produce maybe 40 to 60%, something like that, and renewables something like 10%, even less. Nuclear is similar, 10% or less of the CO2 emissions compared to coal. So there's a massive improvement. Right? So 10 to 1 improvement is huge, and yes, it's not nothing. And from the environmental movement, we need to stop pretending that it's nothing and pretending that it's good for the environment. But at the same time, to argue that it's no different from coal is simply physically untrue. There are, again, inexplicably absurd moments in the documentary where they're looking at, say, plants that are running on renewable energy, and they're showing how that they are still hooked up to the electricity grid, and saying, therefore, this is all kind of a waste of time. I don't know how they could be. I don't know what's going through their minds when they're making these arguments. When I set up Santi Forest Monastery, maybe 15 years ago, we put some solar on the roof and we hooked it up to the grid, and when the sun is shining and we have too much electricity, we sell it to the grid, and when we need more electricity and the sun's not shining, we buy it back from the grid. That's how it works. And that's one of the major ways that we solve the problem of the intermittency of renewable energies. Again, a huge problem which was raised, is a genuine problem, raised in the film over and over again, but with no real discussion of how intermittency is being addressed. And that's one of the ways. And they're sort of pointing to the fact that these renewables are connected to the grid as being a problem, whereas in fact it's one of the major ways that intermittency is being addressed. So there are all these kind of clownishly inept arguments that are being made throughout the whole thing. There are other arguments that are perhaps that have some truth to them, but still not really kind of looking at the broader problem. For example, they looked at cases where the installation of renewables had destroyed ecosystems, destroyed a desert, destroyed forests, destroyed a mountaintop, and again the implied conclusion being, well, these are just as bad as the fossil fuels that they're supposed to be replacing. But the problem is that they have really cherry-picked these examples. I don't have figures to hand, but my understanding from a number of the people who rebutted these arguments, and I've no doubt that they are right, is that these are very much an exception, and that most renewable energies are put onto farmland, unused land or wasteland, where the environmental impact is much less. Now, that's the response of those who would be criticizing the claims made in the film. In cases where renewables are put onto environmentally sensitive land, then that shouldn't happen, and it would seem that that's the kind of problem that could be addressed quite satisfactorily through appropriate regulation. And we've been regulating land use for a long time. We know how to do it, and it can be done in a perfectly fine way. So we can stop those kinds of destructive developments. So I think, again, yes, it's a problem. Those things shouldn't be happening. At the same time, like, what is our response to it? In that particular case, a simple regulation should be good enough to solve that problem. But then that again hides attention from a wider problem which we're looking at, which is, okay, let's look at the majority of renewables which are on farming land and on land that is, relatively speaking, less, has less diversity, less richness in terms of the ecosystem. Now, even the most degraded of farmland isn't nothing, and it has weeds, and it has insects, and it has little creatures in the soil, and it has worms, and there have birds and lizards, snakes. And even any kind of farmland has actually a complex and rich ecosystem there. Of course, much less complex and rich than a virgin forest or a pristine desert, but still not nothing, very far from being nothing. And if we're making developments in those areas, we're still having some environmental impact, and we can't just say that it's nothing. If renewables are being built on farmland, essentially what you're doing is you're putting an industrial installation onto a farming area, and that has implications. I mean, at the very least, it has the implication that that land can't be used for anything else. So clearly, it could be used either for farming, for producing food, or if it's no use for producing food, the land could be rewilded. We have other options. We could be doing other things for it, but instead we're building these industrial parks, essentially, these wind farms and solar farms and so on land that could be made into something that's beautiful and environmentally diverse. So there is a cost, and let's not pretend that there isn't a cost. Now, so when we talk about renewables, I mean, actually, what do we mean? Like the whole way that environmentalists talk about renewables is almost like kind of anti-physics, really. It's the way that we try to sell it is that this is kind of free energy from the sun. It's like we're producing energy out of nothing. No, it's not actually really like that. Why? Because we're living in an ecosystem, and the ecosystem consists of the exchange of energy in all kinds of ways. And when we start extracting massive amounts of energy from that ecosystem, we are changing that ecosystem. That's what's happened with the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And if we are pulling solar energy out of that ecosystem, we're changing things. If we use wind farms, for example, we're slowing down the wind. If we use wave energy, then we are dampening the ocean. If we're using solar energy, then we are capturing sunlight that could have been used otherwise for growing plants. None of these things have no cost. They all have a cost, and they all consist of shifting energy around in a system, shifting energy away from nature to us. I mean, I don't want to I don't want to situate humanity as being apart from or separate from nature. So perhaps shifting energy away from the rest of the ecosystem towards us. And that has costs and has consequences. And underlying the whole development of renewable energy is the kind of the conceit, really, that the cost is worth it because we're us. And, it's not going to be too bad. And anyway, we're more valuable than all of those other things that we're taking the energy away from. I don't quite know what to say, but I think that's the morality which is underlying these things. So renewables are, on the one hand, they are certainly much less damaging to the environment than coal, no doubt about that. On the other hand, the cost of them is not nothing, and in fact the cost is very serious. What is the alternative? Like, what is our way forward? What kind of approaches could we be using? Well, let me give you a little bit of a thought experiment. And this is purely me playing around with a few numbers. Please do not take it too seriously. But just a way of framing questions. Let's imagine that we had a town that consumed 100 units of electricity. I'm just making up the units now because it's easy to do the math. And that was produced by coal, and the coal had an output of 100 units of CO2. So we're using 100 electricity and we're producing 100 CO2. Okay? Now, the electricity demand of the city doubles over time due to population growth, partly, but mostly due to economic growth. And again, it just side note that one of the issues raised in the film was about population and economic growth. And it's important to note that, yes, obviously, as population increases, then it will use more resources. But the problem of climate change and resource use is far more strongly driven by economic growth than by population growth. Generally speaking, in the world, population growth is on decline, and human population is now usually predicted to level out around 10 or 11 billion people in a few decades' time. So which is why population growth is not at the forefront of the solutions that are being proposed for climate change. Not to say that it isn't an issue, but it's not the most important issue. The most important issue is consumption and economic growth. Anyway, back to our hypothetical town. And so in our hypothetical town, 100 consumption of electricity, 100 emission of CO2 produced by coal. That's fine. So we need more electricity. Demand has doubled. So what do? Well, we are modern people. We are environmentally friendly people. We want to do the right thing. Let's make some renewables. Great. We install a renewable solar array or whatever it is, and we now produce that extra 100 units of electricity with renewables, and we have CO2 emissions of only 10 from that solar array, remembering that renewables typically have CO2 emissions maybe 10% of that of coal. Again, just roughly, don't take these numbers too seriously. So is that good or is that bad? Well, it kind of depends on how you look at it. If you look at it in terms of efficiency, absolutely it's improvement. So, previously we were producing one unit of electricity per CO2. Now we're producing nearly 2 units of electricity per CO2, a bit under 2. So efficiency is better. It's certainly better than if building a coal plant was the alternative, then it's certainly better than building the coal plant, no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's not actually good. It doesn't actually help the environment. We're now emitting 110 CO2, whereas before we were emitting 100 CO2. We haven't actually got any better. We haven't improved anything. We have increased our emissions. And this is one of the points which is made in the film, is that very often renewables projects don't replace older coal-based projects, but they exist side by side with them. And if you look at and this is absolutely true, although again it's not really established by the facts given in the film, but if you look at the overall usage of coal, oil, fossil fuels and renewables in the world today, you'll see that the growth in the use of coal, oil and other fossil fuels continues unabated. And renewables are also increasing rapidly. And, often we look at that and we think, oh, yes, there's more renewables. There's a greater percentage of renewables. Terrific. But it hasn't actually stopped us from burning all the coal. So anyway, come back to our town. We now have 110 units of CO2 and we're producing 200 units of electricity. That's great. Now, time goes on and these things must expand according to the ethos of capitalism. We have to have economic growth and so on. So a little bit later, now we have demand for 300 units of electricity. Okay, so what do we do then? Well, we put in some more renewable. Now, by this time, the coal plant is getting old and probably needs replacing. The average lifespan of a coal-fired power plant is between maybe 20 to 50 years. So let's replace that with renewables. Okay, so now we're producing 300 units of electricity for 30 units of CO2, right? So that's great. We've now actually cut our CO2 emissions by a third. Sorry, to a third. We cut it by 2/3 to a third of what it was, while tripling the amount of electricity we're producing. Everybody should be happy, right? Well, okay, again, efficiency-wise, comparison-wise, it's great, but the reality is we're still pumping significant amounts of CO2 into the environment, and we're still creating a significant environmental cost. One of the things that this kind of analysis tends to distract us from is the fact that CO2 is cumulative. So it's not that past 100 units of CO2 has gone. It stays in the environment. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's obviously a cycle and absorption and so on of CO2, but generally speaking, CO2 is cumulative, and that's one of the big problems with climate change. So that the problem here is that we're still we're emitting less, but we have less headroom to emit. And think about it. If you can think about this in terms of your household finances. Maybe you inherit $1 million. You're like, great, I've inherited $1 million. You go on a bit of a splurge. You spend $500,000 in a year. And then you go to your accountant for advice or something like that, and they say, well, you can't keep on doing that. And you're like, well, okay, so for the next year I'll only spend like $300,000 instead of $500,000. And they're like, well, you can if you want, but you got rid of half of your money already. So maybe, and they're like, but I've cut back my spending so much. Well, you've cut back your spending on a lower capital, and so our capital, the amount that we can actually use before hitting catastrophic climate change, is very small. And so even though we're making these improvements, it's still pushing us closer to that brink, if we haven't reached that brink already. Now, that's one of the problems there, but there's an even deeper problem, and again a problem that's alluded to in the Planet of the Humans, but which is not really kind of brought out, and I think is one of the deeper problems of this whole issue. And that is that we are training, by doing this whole process, you're training people to believe that they can have whatever they want without having to pay any cost. You're training people with the idea that we'll figure it out. We'll be able to get all of the things we want. We'll be able to run our aircon all the time. We'll be able to get that new jacuzzi. We'll be able to get that second fridge and that third freezer. We'll be able to get big television sets in every room. We'll be able to get all the things that we want and still be good. Again, this is one of the problems with electric vehicles. You persuade people that having a Tesla is green and environmentally friendly. It creates that prestige for the person who's driving it. But the reality is you're still harming the environment. Actually, you're better off just catching a bus. But that's not prestigious. So what will happen then, inevitably, and I can't say this strongly enough, inevitably, is that people will invent new, bizarre, and incredibly stupid ways of wasting vast quantities of electricity. And so once you have 300 units of electricity, you'll want 500. And once you've got 500, you'll want 1,000. And once you're using 1,000, you're actually producing as much CO2 as you were when you were burning coal. I mean, what kinds of things are they going to do? Well, I mentioned it before, Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin cryptocurrencies is just literally producing nothing, producing just pixie dust. And the electricity consumption of Bitcoin alone today is equivalent to the electricity used by Thailand. For nothing. These are just entries on a spreadsheet. It means nothing. It's just like a digital game that people are playing with buying and selling things. These things have no more reality than buying stuff in a video game. It's just pieces of nonsense that people ascribe a value to. It doesn't create anything real in the world, and it's burning up vast quantities. And so one of the arguments that the crypto bros will use is that, you know, we're shifting over to renewables, so therefore it will be okay. And so the argument is, well, yes, maybe right now I burn down a forest in order to play with my pixie dust, and that's morally justifiable because I imagine that in the future I'll be able to burn down only half a forest to play with my pixie dust. And so by consuming all of this electricity, by leeching off of the renewables, then they're driving up the cost of renewables for everyone. They're driving up the environmental impact of renewables for everyone. And they are, once again, contributing to this ideology that we can make money out of nothing. That's the whole point. That's why people do this. They believe that they have some kind of right to make money out of nothing, and that justifies burning the world down. So allow me to trace out a alternative path. Imagine come back to our town with using 100 units of electricity, producing 100 units of CO2, and perhaps they might choose a different way. Rather than, when the electricity demand increases, rather than saying, yes, let's build more energy for that, what if they were to say, let's cut down our electricity use? How do you do that? Well, you have an education program. You persuade people, you get out there, you make the effort, and you get people to cut down on their usage. It can work, and in addition to that, you penalise overusage. You have a strongly progressive pricing system so that households that use little electricity pay a relatively cheap amount, and households that use more, as you use more electricity, it becomes much, much, much more expensive. And you do that and by doing that, you of course are penalising the rich, because it's the rich who use the electricity. So the state makes money from the taxes, and the rich have to pay for their indulgences. And by doing so, let's assume that you drive down the electricity usage to, say, 50 units of electricity for the town. And let's not forget that until 20 years ago or 30 years ago, no town in the world used more electricity than that. I mean, we're not talking about going back to the Stone Age. We're talking about using the same amount of resources that we did when we were kids, depending on the age of the people who might be listening to this. As talking about just not grotesquely and gratuitously wasting electricity for no purpose. That's what we're talking about. So we reduce the electricity down to 50%. So we've now saved 50% of our CO2. So rather than installing renewable energies where we increased the CO2 emissions from 100 to 110, we've now immediately decreased the CO2 emissions from 100 to 50. We haven't installed any renewables. We haven't done anything. All we've done is make people use less. Now, as time goes on, that coal plant becomes less effective, it ages, and, well, turns out that the city also has money in the bank because they've been taxing the rich. So why don't we replace that coal plant with a renewables plant, which we're now producing we now don't need so much electricity production, so we can now replace that with a renewables plant that will produce only 5 units of CO2 for the 50 units of electricity that they need. So we're now instead of increasing the amount of CO2 and in the long term perhaps reducing it, we are now immediately reducing the amount of CO2 and to a much lower level. And so not only are you doing that, but we are also training our people and training ourselves culturally to take responsibility for our actions. This is something that every culture must learn to do. This is the fundamental thing. We cannot avoid it. We have to learn that there is a cost. We have to learn that we must live within our means. Nature is abundant. We only create scarcity because of our greed. And so no matter what the solution is, we will overconsume it if we believe that we can just get something from nothing. And this is why these technologies like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, this is why this whole kind of infinite growth mindset will lead to tragedy. Absolutely. We must start teaching ourselves that we need to restrain ourselves, that we need to moderate our desires. And the simplest, quickest, and most effective way to address climate change is to have less, to use less, to be restrained, to renounce, to be moderate. And this is the message that our environmental movement has failed to sell, and it's a message that we need to sell. It's a message that we need to accept. We can't have everything. We can't simply have everything we want and never pay the cost for it. So anyway, these are a few of my thoughts on the Planet of the Humans documentary and various issues that raised up with regards to climate change. So I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a bit of an experiment for me to see about what this would be like to record an audio of this length. Anyway, I wish you the best, and I hope that you will be happy, and I hope that you will find a way to live in a way that is going to create abundance and to create blessing in the world, and not in a way that is going to create destruction.